Hello everyone, welcome to the Royal Institution for an entirely non-controversial evening in which we will finally solve the questions of race and racism. I'm Adam Rutherford, I'm a science writer, broadcaster, I present Inside Science on Radio 4, and in the style of how Martin has just introduced himself, I am half English. My father was born in the northeast of England but was raised in New Zealand. I'm half Indian, though my mother has never set foot in India. She was born in Guyana, but I was raised by my stepmother, who's from Essex, although we recently discovered that her father, my grandfather, was raised by the Sisters of Mercy as an orphan, not the bands, the Sisters of Mercy, the nuns, the Sisters of Mercy, although the first option would have been much cooler, as an orphan in Liverpool. But his father, whose name was John Adams, his actual name was Joseph Abrahamson, and he was an Orthodox Jew who was naturalized when he emigrated in the end of the 19th century. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves in exactly the same way.
I'm Kenan Malik, but before I do so, I have to tell you a ritual that most black and Asian, in fact most minority people, go through, which is someone will buttonhole you and they'll say, where are you from? And I'll say, I live in London. And they'll say, no, where are you really from? And I'll say, I grew up in Manchester. No, where are you really from? And I'll say, I was born in India. And they'll say, as if they found me. And in fact, it's probably the least significant aspect of what I am now. But to play the game, as it were, my mother comes from South India. She's Hindu. My father comes from Burma. They're Indians who moved to Burma several generations before, came back to India when the Japanese invaded in 1942. He's Muslim. And as for me, I'm still hoping to find a human being inside me sometime.
So me?
Aoife.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my name's Aoife McLysaght, and I'm Irish, and my parents are Irish, and my grandparents are Irish. And I did my 23andMe hoping I'd find some family mystery or some little bit of scandal. So 23andMe is one of these genotyping companies, and it came out as 100% Irish, which it was just very disappointing. So,
Heidi.
I'm Heidi Mirza, and I don't really want to play this game. And that's largely because who are we, who am I, is a really contentious issue. And how often do we get to tick a box to say who we are? Nearly just about every day you have to tick an ethnic monitoring box. And I want to rail against that. And I would never go for a genetic test. And I would say that who I am isn't as important as what I do. So I'm Professor of Race, Faith and Culture. And I would also say that that's not an accident, because who we are is because of what we've gone through, our experiences. So when I came from the Caribbean to England in the 70s, the racism in my school formed me and made me want to ask questions about identity. So it isn't who I am, but what I do is who I am. Excellent. If you get what I mean.
I do, and in fact, that was exactly what Batman says. I need to give credit where it's due as well, because this event was organised by a friend of ours and a friend of science, a guy called Alam Shahar, who many of you will know. He's the author of the book, The Young Atheist's Handbook. And I just want to tell a very quick story about Alam, who couldn't be here tonight. So some of you will also know the science journalist Alok Jar, who used to write for The Guardian and is now the science correspondent for ITV. And you'll also notice that Alok and Alom are only one letter difference, and the three of us are friends. And there was an event we were doing at the Wellcome Trust a couple of years ago where Alom was speaking, and I had gone with Alok. And we arrived slightly early, and the security guy, who was a slightly older chap, and was doing his best, But when we introduced ourselves, he said, well, you need to go through to the green room because you're on stage. And Alok said, no, that's Alom who's on stage. We're just his guests. And the security guard kind of chuckled to himself and said, oh, it's an easy mistake to make because you're both, and both of us just went, what? Did you just do the hand wavy thing? Wow, I didn't think that really actually happened anymore. So in some ways, that kind of frames the way I'm going to attempt to structure this evening, and I'm very aware that that structure will soon fall apart. But Aoife and I are geneticists. I'm a recovering geneticist. Aoife is a practicing geneticist. Kenan is a sort of social...
An in-betweener who does nothing.
Kenan does nothing at all, but has written extensively on race and has a profound understanding of genetics. And Heidi, as was already described, is more on the sociological side. So I'm nominally, according to the title, which isn't up there, I'm nominally dividing the evening up into talk about race and what that is, and then racism and what that is separately. And the question is, how does science help us understand one, both, or either of those terms? And by 8:30, I think we'll have it perfectly sorted. At least that's the challenge. And I run a pretty loose ship, as you can probably tell. Most of my notes are blank. And so I want to open it up to the audience as soon as possible, and I think we're friendly enough here on a night like this to, if you stick your hand up at any point, and I notice you, then I will direct questions from the audience. And at some point, we'll open up properly and bring the lights up and have as much of a conversation as we can. So, in the manner that I have already described, I want to talk about the hard, straightforward science up front. I also want to talk about the genetics that you mentioned in terms of having genetic ancestry testing and what that means and what it actually tells us in a bit. But first, I'm going to turn to you, Aoife, as the resident geneticist, and dealing right now, in the present, contemporary genetics, post-human genome, what does the concept of race mean to the average geneticist?
So I think if you talk to just about any geneticist, and if they're talking about race, the first thing they will say at the beginning of their talk is race does not exist. Human race does not exist. So the term race, in terms of biology, has been used to describe within a population subgroups that are a bit separate from each other. And what you're talking about genetically in that case is you're saying, well, this group are more like each other than any of them is like the other group. And this group, similarly, are all quite like each other more than any is like the other group. And this is not at all what we see in human populations. In human populations, what we see is the vast majority of genetic variation is shared worldwide, and you find it everywhere. So about 85 to 90% of the variation that exists is found everywhere. It's not geographically isolated. And we see this is true because we are a very young species, so there hasn't been very much time for differences to accumulate and to become separated. And it's also true because we have always been and we continue to mix a lot. And so all of our genes are shared worldwide. So if you're talking about race from a genetic point of view, in humans, we say it doesn't exist. In other species, you might argue that it does exist. But in humans, we're a very young species. We're constantly mixing. And you don't find these divisions. So if you measure genetic variation, you can't find a group that is really so much more similar within the group than they are to individuals between groups. So what we typically think of as races or just even people from different geographic origins, if you pick two Inuits and ask how genetically similar are they, and you find a similar level of genetic difference between two Inuits than you do between an Inuit and a German or or somebody from India. So you find the same amount of genetic difference, even though there are some outward physical characteristics that we can see which do have geographic patterns, which some of those are for other reasons.
Whereas, if you were to take, on average, any two people from the African continent, they are going to be more genetically different from each other than they are to anyone else on Earth. Well, how do we measure that? What does that actually mean? I mean, that's one of those oft-quoted things, but what are we actually talking about when we say genetic similarities or genetic variation between people?
So, well, we have the technology nowadays to sequence the entire DNA. So it's, and it is, we do talk about it as a sequence of letters. And it is as simple as just the number of letters that are different between individuals. And then there are geographic patterns within that. And the reason we see the most of the richest genetic diversity in humans exists in Africa because our species originated in Africa. So if I was to revise my self-introduction more correctly, I should say I'm an African and all my ancestors are Africans and we're all Africans.
Apart from the Neanderthals, who are very European.
Well, the Neanderthals are a little bit more European, but everybody has a bit of Neanderthal. But they still had, they came from Africa too, just a little earlier.
Right. Kenan, what about, so, you know, in terms of the genetics, that is what Aoife's just said there is non-controversial. When we look at human variation at a genetic level, we see no essential characteristics that isolate with one particular group over another. And yet, everyone kind of knows what race is. Most people agree that race exists. Racism is a real thing. We see physical differences. Incredibly diverse audience, by the way. I've done many of these at the Royal Institution over the years, but I don't think I've ever seen so many non-white faces. So, well done, you lot. Including on stage, actually.
Maybe it's got something to do with the topic.
I think it's random variation. People know, you know, there are physical differences between people. There are very obvious physical differences between people, and most people many people are willing to make statements which allow them to geographically isolate one group over another. So how does that relate to what Aoife's just said in terms of genetic diversity being relatively insignificant?
That's a very complicated question, but let me deal with one aspect of it. One of the reasons I think that science finds it so difficult to get a handle on race is because we're very peculiar as human beings. There are no such thing as natural human groups. Things like migration, intermarriage, war, conquest, forced assimilation, voluntary segregation, all political and social rules, customs, such as the one-drop rule in America, which deems that if you've got one black ancestor, you are black, or you're socially regarded as black, and so on. All those things mean that all the categories into which we people are social categories. But at the same time, social categories, the way we put people into categories, whether it's by nation, by ethnicity, by faith, by whatever, by culture, they're not entirely arbitrary. People do self-segregate to a certain extent within certain groups, and therefore social groups can have certain biological consequences. And it's the difficulty in understanding the relationship between those two, I think, which makes it difficult to think about race. Race doesn't exist, and yet there are differences between human populations. And the difficulty is that because we think in terms of race, where differences are important, we often don't connect with the right differences. Take something like sickle cell anemia. Now, everybody knows that sickle cell anemia is a black disorder. It's a disorder of black people, except it isn't. Sickle cell anemia is a disorder of those who've grown up in areas whose ancestors come from areas where malaria was prevalent. West Africa is one of those areas. So is the Mediterranean basin. So is parts of Turkey and the Saudi Peninsula. So are parts of India. But because socially we imagine black, and we think of black largely through the process of slavery and so on, we imagine that black is to do with West Africans or their descendants, because most of black people in America and in Britain have come from there. So we imagine that sickle cell is a black disorder. And that's to do with our social imagination, nothing to do with biology. And it raises a major problem, because if we think of sickle cell as a black disorder, It means there are large groups, for example, in Britain, who may suffer from sickle cell, for example, Cypriots, Indians, who are ignored because it is seen as a black disorder. So what I'm trying to say is that the categories into which we put people socially are not actually particularly useful when we want to talk about genetic differences between groups. And the problem we always make, I think, is that we always think about that there are kind of essential differences between groups. The point is there are lots of differences that cut across human societies in lots of ways. And that when we talk about differences, the important question to ask is, what do we want? What question are we asking and in what context? And depending on the question we're asking and depending on the context we want, the kinds of groups that are important to us and the kind of differences that are important to us actually keeps changing. And that, I think, is what we forget when we talk about human differences, that these kinds of differences are contextual. They depend upon the questions we're asking and the context in which we're asking them. Unfortunately, we don't group people into the category their ancestors came from areas which were malaria prevalent. If so, then we could deal with questions of the issue of sickle cell very easily. But because our social categories are not of that form, then it becomes much more difficult to deal with these kinds of issues. But it seems to me that the really important thing to remember is that when we're talking about human differences, we have to ask, what question are we asking and in what context are we asking that? And then we can work out which differences are significant and which are not. So
there's an equivalent to the sickle cell story, which I think is of relevance here, which is the discovery of the disease Tay-Sachs. So it's a disease discovered by two different doctors, Dr. Tay, and see if you can guess the other guy's name, in around about 1880. And both times they discovered the existence of this gene in heavily inbred Jewish families in the States, one in the States and one in London. And so this Tay-Sachs was the first disease which got labeled as effectively a racial or culturally specific disease. And to this day, people, when I talk about Tay-Sachs, refer to it as the Jewish disease. Now, by about 1884, about 3 years after it was first described, the first examples of Tay-Sachs were described in, as was the language then, the acceptable language, in Gentile families. And to the extent that it was isolated as a culturally specific, as a Jewish disease, they were given a different diagnosis, and it wasn't called Tay-Sachs in these kids, even though every single one of the symptoms was identical. And that sort of labeling continues to this day. There are songs by, there's a Tupac song which references, no it doesn't, it references sickle cell as an insult. And that's in the 1990s. I want to ask you, Heidi, if these sorts of labels that we do so casually have any value to us, have any positive value to us in terms of establishing our own identity. I mean, we talked about being black, but at the same time, we've referenced the fact that, from a genetic point of view, talking about black people is pretty much meaningless.
Yeah, well, I think we need to go back in time, way back. Do you know that song? Those of you from the 70s might know that. It was about becoming a Neanderthal. But I think if you look at a watershed moment, which was the Enlightenment period, which is the 18th, 19th century, we find that there was this real impulse, this real desire to classify the natural order of the world. And that natural order is where science comes in, because they measured difference. And that is a key turning point to explain why we have certain categories now. So at that time, there was somebody called Cuvier, who in the 1830s developed a classificatory system. And that classificatory system was based on different types or races. And I remember at school, and it was 60s, 50s, 60s, a big map on of the world on the wall. And it was divided up not only into empire, but also different. There was pink, I think I remember, was Mongoloid, and then there was Caucasoid, and then Oriental, and they were all different colors on the map. And that was the world that I grew up in. Do any of you recognize that world? Mm-hmm. And that was the natural order of things. And then we gave that natural order different values. So, for example, we would say, when we look at the race science of that era, they measured skulls. Different sized skulls meant different levels of intelligence. And of course, there was a hierarchy in which the white male was at the top, and, right down to people who were black, people of color, who were seen closer to apes. So it was this evolutionary notion of difference. And I would argue very much that that has stuck. And even though that's 200 years ago, we still see those patterns today because we were drawn to this idea of natural difference. It was a classificatory system that seemed to explain the order of the world. And that's what we were doing in Enlightenment time. We were looking at this order.
Although I feel compelled.
Science and rationality was the underpinning part of this.
Classification in biology is incredibly important. It's also something which hamstrings much of biology, but that's a slightly different conversation. But it's worth pointing out, though, that Darwin was pretty explicitly opposed to what you've just described, and was a non-essentialist in terms of, as the father, as the person who described evolution accurately for the first time. He was adamant that there were no essential characteristics in any one group of people which were referred to as races, but that's not in the same way that we use the term these days, that wasn't fluid, that wasn't a characteristic that would pass through time and would be transferable from one group of people to the other. Kenan, I think you were going to say something.
Interestingly, you don't have to go to Darwin. Blumenbach, from whom we derive the 5 categories of races. He, in fact, made much the same point. He made the point that these are categories that are necessary if we want to divide human beings. But actually, human beings don't naturally fit into those categories. There is a continuation between those categories. So it's important, in a sense. It's not simply the categorization of human beings that's a problem. The categorization of human beings and of the natural world, from the late 17th century, I suppose, Linnaeus and so on, moved apace. But racial science was a product of the mid-19th century. It wasn't a product of the 18th century. It wasn't a product of the early scientific revolution. It wasn't a product of the period in which they categorized humans. It wasn't a product of the Enlightenment as such. Racial science actually developed much later. And so, the interesting question is, why is it that racial science doesn't develop with categorization as such, but develops much later? And I think that's an interesting question. The other interesting question is this, that if you look at how, say, 19th century scientists, intellectuals categorized humans, it's very different from the way we think about it now. They didn't, primarily, they weren't using categories of skin color. The main difference for them was actually of class and of social differences. So 19th century thinkers would look on the working class and the rural poor as racially distinct. Now, they saw them as distinct as people today would see whites and blacks as racially distinct. For them, it was as obvious as that. And so,
this is a lot to do with the work of one particular man, who we ought to name, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. He he was relatively obsessed with social hierarchy as well as racial definitions. And again, it's worth pointing out that we use the word race in the 19th century not in accordance with the way we think of it now, but as a sort of subspecies. So Darwin talks about race, type, ecotype. We sometimes use that word in genetics now, but the subtitle to The Origin of Species contains this phrase, the struggle for races. And he's talking mostly not about, in fact, he's not talking about humans at all. He's talking about cabbages. He's talking about subtypes of cabbages. So we have to be careful about the language. It's very important that we talk specifically about, when we say race in the 19th century, we're not talking about the way we use the term today, right? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay, so Galton, I interrupted you. You were about to start.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I mean, Galton's important. I'm not sure it's that. I know you're writing a book in which you play a central role. But,
plug.
But if we
which is out in September.
But if we ignore that,
and I went to the Galton laboratory.
If you read English newspapers, for instance, from well before Galton, what you find descriptions of the Bethnal Green poor, where they're described as of a race of whom we know nothing, a race of whom we are entirely different, a race whose differences with us are akin, and this is a quote, are similar to the difference between whites and slaves. So it's difficult in a way to get a handle on that, because we look on race in a very different way. We look on human differences in a very different way. But in the 19th century, the way that humans were categorized and the way that racial categories existed was very different from the way they are today. And it arose out of social distinctions as much as distinctions of skin color, which plays an important part today.
Let's just talk about skin colour and those categorisations for a minute, because Heidi introduced a very important historical, the classical way of dividing the races of the Earth into 5 categories, which were, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Aboriginal, Australian, Amerindian, and Negroid. Thank you. And interestingly, forensic medicine still uses those definitions, even though almost all other branches of science don't. Now, Aoife, I want you to mention the first major study of the genetics of human variation.
Noah
Rosenberg in 2004. Because it does something quite interesting in relation to Heidi's, the classification that Heidi mentioned.
Okay, so I just like to say it's interesting in terms of what you were saying, Kenan, that when these 19th century guys said that the difference between them and the working class was as great as the difference between them and black people, they were correct, but just not in the way they thought. There's no difference. But in any case, so this work that Adam's asked me to talk about, so it's from, I think, 2002. And so this, in the last just over 10 years, we've had a big revolution in genetics enabled by technology. And so we've been able to sequence genomes, so the total DNA of people, and there's been this big scientific effort to try and sample human diversity. So there's this project where they got volunteers who gave a DNA sample, and this was about 1,000 people or so thereabouts from all over the world, so lots of different geographic localities. And what they did was they used the best technology at the time to sequence these bits of DNA and to measure the differences. And so you can look at, for each individual, you've got the little set of letters they have that are variable somewhere in somebody. So it turns out about 1 every 1,000 letters is different somewhere in somebody. And when they did this, then they applied this statistical clustering technique. So it's a mathematical technique we don't need to get into the details of. But basically what it does is, if you say, divide this these data into two groups, it'll divide them into the best two groups it can. If you say divide it into 3 groups, it'll find the best division to force it into 3, and if you say 4, and if you say 5. So when you say divide it into 2 groups, it comes out basically Africa and everywhere else, roughly. And then when you say 3 groups, I think was the next one that popped out was European? Did I get that wrong?
Eastern Asian.
Okay, yes. But then with the interesting thing, I think the point that Adam wants me to get to, this will happen a lot, is that when you insist on 5 groups, the groupings come out roughly along those lines of African, Amerindian,
Caucasian.
Yeah, Caucasian. So Caucasians, yeah, Europeans, then the Southeast
Eurasian, Eastern Asian.
Yeah.
Aboriginal.
So it comes out approximately the way those awful maps were. And so depending on how you want to read this, you can have your racism reinforced, and people choose to do that. But then the thing is, if you decide to make 6 groupings, if you say, well, what are the 6 most natural biological groupings, then suddenly this group in the northeast of India pops out as just special all out on its own, and that nobody had ever, So there's a few things going on here. So I suppose as a geneticist, I suffer a bit in terms of genetics has a horrible history in this. At certain points in time, genetics was used to try and justify racism. And so people try to say, if there are genetic differences, then anything I claim, any horrible view I hold is somehow scientifically justified. And so people have been trying to use genetics. So the first thing we see is that, and what I said at the beginning is still true, about 85 to 90% of genetic variation is shared worldwide. So when you find these patterns, what you're finding is of the bits that aren't shared, so you're kind of saying if you really insist and you take the bits that aren't shared, well then do they have patterns? And yes, they do. And then you also have some things that are just a bit more common one place than the other. But one thing about race then and the idea of race. So I am a scientist and I hope that I'm led by the data. I'm still a human being, so I can't claim that I never make mistakes. But but in terms of race, I'm convinced that I'm led by the data when I say there's no such thing as race in human populations. But if there were, I would accept that, but I would never accept that as any kind of justification for any kind of prejudice. So in terms of, we have another kind of biological difference that we see in human populations, which is just slightly more than 50% of the population are female and the rest are male. And this is a very big biological distinction. You can find biological traits that are very, very different between these two groups, and that in no way just, there's plenty of them, Adam, you'll think of one. But this in no way justifies any kind of prejudice. So race doesn't exist biologically and genetically, but if it did, still wouldn't be.
Heidi, how do you feel about that? Not the difference between men and women, but just that sort of very stark statement that race doesn't exist.
It's wonderful that genetics can say this, but you said that that you're a human being and that you have the way you look at the data will automatically come through the lens of the social world that we live in. So when we began our conversation, you said, that you were Irish. So therefore, and genetically you are
50-50 mix, North
mix.
European and South Asian.
And you're using racial categories to describe those genetic categories that really don't really exist. So at the same time that you say they do exist, we still are using categories in order to understand the data. And one of the ways that this plays out very much, and I know we're talking about genetics, but the way in which genetics then moves into the kind of medical and other ways in which it's used. So for example, it's used for various drugs targeted at particular communities. So for example, there is a drug called Beadil that is actually targeted at African American communities. Now if race doesn't exist, Why are we targeting certain communities? And this is what we call in the social sciences the biopolitics that goes on in terms of the way in which race becomes marketable, huge monies for biotech companies to target certain groups. I heard Nike has actually developed a special trainer for indigenous Native Americans because they have bigger feet. How about that? I mean, that's an incredible thing. So you can say that genetically we can find Native American people have bigger feet and therefore we'll make them bigger shoes. And so to counteract obesity in those groups. And so it's really interesting that we do not have, if you like, an innocent science of genetics. So we might say that race doesn't exist, but it isn't innocent. Genetics is not neutral. It comes through our filters, our social filters, and our categories that pre-exist. Nationalist categories, like I mentioned before, we tick boxes, we say that we belong to certain racial groups, national groups, Pakistani or Indian, Welsh.
Aren't you conflating, you're conflating two things at the same time, though? Being Irish is a national geographical identity.
Yes.
That's not. No one would say that the Irish are a race, would they?
No, they wouldn't. But who went to the Celts to see the Celts at the British Museum? It was fascinating because when you look at the idea of a Celtic race or a Celtic group, it actually came down to the emergence of a nationalistic impulse at the turn of the century. So it's really interesting how we use both race and culture and classifications simultaneously, and there are consequences to that.
Tell me about the medicine, though. I mean, if genetics has neutralized race as a concept, but at the same time there are genetic differences between people, and some of those organize themselves along geographical boundaries. What Heidi was just mentioning there about the targeting of specific pharmaceuticals towards specific groups, is that valid? Is that something that carries any scientific, let's separate out the politics of the pharmaceutical business, but is it something that could be justified scientifically?
I think the difficulty is what I was trying to explain before, which is that in order for geneticists to look at human groups, they're usually forced to use social groups, socially created groups. Now, socially created groups socially defined groups aren't natural groups of any kind. But it's usually the case that social groups have a greater degree of, two individuals within a social group have a greater degree of relatedness than two random individuals, however small that may be. And in certain circumstances, that may be useful in science and in medicine. But in many cases, it's not. And that's the ambiguity. That's the difficulty of thinking about this. The fact that there is a greater degree of relatedness within a particular social group doesn't mean that the biological reality of race, that race is a biological reality. It just refers to the fact that there are genetic differences between populations. So if you take any two populations, you'll find genetic differences. That's the point. The kind of great doyen of population genetics, Cavalli Sforza, he made this point that if you take the people of Pisa and the people of Florence and you look at enough genes, you will find genetic differences between those two groups. If you take the people of Islington and the people of Lambeth, that will be the same. So the point is that you can find genetic differences between any four sorts of groups, but the groups that geneticists have to use usually are socially defined groups, and it's the conflict between the fact that they have to use socially defined groups and the fact that genetics seems to tell us something about scientifically about the nature of being human and the nature of human differences. It's the conflict between those two that causes the problem. If we can understand that these are social groups, socially defined groups, but there may be genetic differences between socially defined groups. But that this tells us nothing about the genetics of race or of racial differences. It'd be a step forward. The trouble is, it's very difficult to do that.
So, for example, the example that Heidi gave about drugs being targeted at African-American communities. Now, we've already stated, it's non-controversial, that there is more genetic diversity within Africa and within African-American people than there is in anyone else in the rest of the world if you compare any two groups.
I'm not sure about African-American people.
Yes, you're right. That's a fair point. So does that mean that, is that targeting, I mean, is that scientifically justified? Is there a mechanism that underlies that where you could say, well, this particular genotype, this particular group of bits of DNA variation are more likely to appear in this group of people than in this group of people, and therefore, actually, that is a justifiable thing to do?
I'm not sure it's scientifically justified, but the fact is that as a society, we have to look for different groups within society, and it's quite useful sometimes to talk about groups within societies, and those groups tend to be socially defined groups. So if you're looking for problems of obesity or heart attacks, it may be that there are certain socially defined groups in which you'll find greater rates of obesity or heart attacks. That's the case because that's how we socially divide up the world. It says nothing about the natural categories of race. It simply says something about the way we divide up the world, and therefore that these categories become proxies because we have no other categories to use. So it's a difficult question, I think, for which there is no straightforward answer. We have to recognise that these are social groups, but social groups can sometimes be useful in telling us that there are genetic differences that are important.
So I think, though, with this, kind of around this question, what we're kind of asking is, sometimes is it useful to think in terms of race, scientifically? Like, does it help you? Does it give you a shortcut in terms of medical diagnosis? Does it help you get to a correct diagnosis? Does it help you get to the correct drug to treat this individual patient? And one of the and for a while it was thought that was the case. For a while people thought, well, this is a kind of a quick shortcut, especially when genetic testing wasn't so easy, that, you know, if this individual has these symptoms and they're black, it may be more likely to be X than Y. And one of the classic examples it was thought of this was hypertension, so high blood pressure in African Americans. So African Americans more often have hypertension than other Americans, and it was thought to be a racial genetic difference, and it turns out it isn't. So there is higher hypertension, but probably for other lifestyle reasons, which have lots of social factors. And so, so this idea that race is a handy proxy, or may in some cases be useful, doesn't even seem to hold out in the cases where it was at some points thought to be useful.
Well, I think that's a really interesting case about the hypertension. It's a bit like, it's part of the other part of the drug that I was talking about for BDIL. And what's really interesting about what you say is that hypertension is more likely in those communities because of poverty, discrimination, and inequality. And that's because of racism.
Yes.
And racism to particular groups. So particular groups will suffer more inequalities and therefore have certain genetic, characteristics. So what we actually are seeing is that
not
there
because of genetic characteristics.
Not because of it,
yes.
But they might display certain similarities. And this is what the drug companies are exploiting, because this means that you can actually target particular groups. And
so it doesn't actually work, though. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it works and it doesn't work. But the reason why we have it, the reason why we are saying that certain groups, exhibit particular characteristics in terms of their genomes, even though, that's done on the medical level, we need to still look at racism and the way that structures society and the opportunities that people have, especially around issues to do with racism and discrimination.
So there's two issues within that which I think are very important. And one is that there's self-identity so people categorizing themselves in racial categories, and also projecting racial stereotypes and myths onto other groups. And that continues to exist to this day. There's a myth about American Indians, Native Americans, being genetically prone to alcoholism, for which there is no evidence. There is the ongoing set of myths about sporting prowess in black people being biologically based rather than environmentally determined, which is also a myth, as far as I understand it. And yet we very comfortably continue to perpetrate these ideas. There was a recent set of articles by sociologists who analysed the way that the media and the public think about sporting success, and more often than not, people and sports commentators would refer to success of black athletes as being something that was biologically determined, and success of white athletes as being something that was determined by their own training regimes and self-determination. Now, there is simply no evidence to support any of those views, and yet they're so culturally ingrained that we just repeat them.
I suppose one thing that happens in terms of, so when we get back to genetics of race, the problem with genetics is that we don't control our own genetics. You inherit the genes you get, and then you have no option but to live with those. So when we have these differences in groups, so we have biological differences or cultural differences wherever they arise from around the world, and certain groups have more of certain traits for all kinds of reasons, but they're not genetic. And I think it's important to remember they're not genetic, because whenever people feel that something is genetic, they feel it's somehow a destiny written out for them that's beyond their control. And that is where the worst of racism comes in. So first of all, the worst of racism says, there are genetic differences that make some people better or worse than things. All of the good things are clustered in me, which is usually what they mean. So first of all, that all the good stuff should land in one place or in one grouping is one of the parts of racism. And there's nothing you can do about it because it is genetic. Therefore, it's a waste of time to try and help these individuals. So when we have these differences that do exist, so, I suppose this is the paradox. So racism is real. Race genetically isn't real. But there also are differences globally. We see this, we know this. Skin color is only the most obvious one, but there are other kinds of differences which come from cultural things, not from genetic things, which means that it isn't a destiny that's pre-written, and everything is completely fluid. And I think that is where genetics has been badly misused. So first of all, presuming that every difference you see must have a genetic biological basis. And that every genetic difference, so even these genetic differences we talked about that allow us to, trace, where somebody may be originated from, they're mostly in the 98% of your DNA that doesn't really do anything. So, they don't even have biological consequences. So I just think it's, this is one of the things that has, one of the things that is used against genetics and kind of to promote racism is that this is a destiny that is all genetic, that every difference is genetic, and that it's predestined.
Have I not heard calls for more black and Asian organ donors because of the need to have a match?
I don't know. Have you? I haven't, but that's interesting that you have. But then again, that plays to the point that Kenan was saying, which is that there are more similarities between groups but simply due to relatedness. So you are more genetically similar to your immediate family and your immediate community with whom you have shared ancestry in the last few generations than you are to another group. So I think that's understandable. I haven't heard that, and probably should have done, but that makes sense.
There have been calls, and there definitely there are social policies, health policies that are moving in that direction. But that is because black and Asian are the social categories into which we put people. They're not necessarily the most useful in finding out, what are genetic matches. But because that's how we divide society, they become useful in health policy, or they become proxies in health policy. Not necessarily entirely usefully, but they are proxies. I think, I mean, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't want to have, but I do think that categories are important. But we just have to recognise what we mean by categories when we put people into categories. If we could divide, if the world was divided into the category of those who are born in areas which have a problem of malaria and those who aren't, that would be a very useful categorisation when it comes to dealing with the question of sickle cell. Now, we don't divide people in that fashion. And so we have to find other kinds of categories that help us deal with the question of sickle cell, of Tay-Sachs, or whatever. Those categories are often imperfect. The trouble is, we then take the fact that we use these other categories, because they're social categories, and then make a claim about the biological basis of race. That's the problem, I think. It's not the categorisation itself. It is what significance we impute into those categorisations, into those differences. That's the problem, I think.
So if you could imagine the rise of a new fascist state where you wanted to extinguish all people who were not immune via sickle cell trait, that would be something that you could actually impose in a purely proper, old-fashioned eugenic way, or people who can process milk into adulthood, which most people on Earth can't do. But we could do that if that were the aim of, I don't know, dairy farmers.
It's worth adding that not everybody who has West African ancestors has sickle cell.
Right.
That's we're talking about proportionalities here.
So this gentleman has kindly done my job for me and opened it up to the audience, and I can see there's a second, or hands are popping up. So there's a question on the back row right there, and then there's a couple in the gods. So if the gentleman in the check shirt first, and are there mics up there?
There's one here.
Okay, so if you can, one quick question that we can answer, no grandstanding statements, and try not to be insane.
Just going back to what you were saying about sporting, when you see the Olympics, obviously you see the front runners are Usain Bolt. America have a black man as their 100-meter sprinter. I heard something, I'm not sure whether it is a myth or true, that black men have, and perhaps women have, an extra muscle or bone or something in the back of their leg.
Extra bone?
Probably not a bone, but a muscle. That allows them to run faster, and over evolution,
sure,
because perhaps they had to walk further, to get water and things like that.
Yeah, no.
I'm not sure whether it was true or not.
So there is. So as often with these things, there are some aspects of truth in some of the things that you just said. So you're absolutely right. There hasn't been a white man in the final of the Olympics since Alan Wells in 1980, who won it. But that was the year that America were boycotting it because it was in Moscow. Now, if that's not a social construct, then I don't know what is. There is, and again, this refers to biological differences between people. There are groups of people who have more fast twitch responses in their muscles. And that does predispose, to a certain degree, you being better at explosive movements than people who have a lower frequency. I am unaware of anything that has ever demonstrated that those occur at a higher frequency in black people than any other class of people. And as we've already said, the term black is effectively meaningless with regards to this conversation. There haven't been nearly as many long-distance runners who are not from, mostly from Eastern Africa in the last many years, the majority of the 20th century. But we broadly also categorize as black, but of course they're not very good at sprinting, those guys. There was a book written in the run-up to the Second World War, which was largely to do with the promotion of Aryans, which declared quite conclusively that the majority of long-distance runners, and this was factually true, were from Finland. And again, I mean, that just says that there are biological differences between people. That is true. How essentialist they are, how they congregate in one particular group of people, I think that's the key difference. But those sorts of things you just said are they're the types of semi-truth, semi-myths that perpetrate through the ages very, very easily. Does anyone else want to?
Well, just on
and then I'll take two questions up there, but go on.
Just on long-distance runners. I mean, again, people are fixated about Kenyans. In fact, if you look at the great long-distance runners, I mean, they're Kenyans, they're Somalis, they're Ethiopians, they're Algerians, they're Moroccans. And if you go to the classic racial categories that use, they're all different categories. They're not all the same racial categories. So people have this fixation about black runners, and therefore they only, when it comes to long-distance runners or middle-distance runners, they think only of Kenyan runners. And they forget, actually, all the other runners from all the other countries that have provided great athletes, long-distance athletes, over the past 10, 20 years. I don't know the figures, but if you look over the last 20 years, you probably find those of Algerian and Moroccan descent probably have won as many medals as those of Kenyan descent. I don't know the figures offhand, but that's quite possible.
Yeah, I think that is true. Jesse Owens' coach, so Jesse Owens being the winner of 4 Olympic golds in the 1938 Olympics, which are, of course, in Berlin, kind of thing that kind of pissed off Hitler. His coach stated afterwards that the Negro race was more, as a result of slavery, as a result of selection, through evolutionary selection through slavery, was more likely to be more physically robust. And that was his coach. Now, again, from an evolutionary...
Michael Johnson, the runner, made a documentary making that point.
Did he?
About 10, 15 years ago, yeah.
Oh, he's my absolute favourite of all time. I used to like the way he leant back when he was running. Sorry, Heidi, you were...
Yeah, I was just going to make the point of pseudoscience, because this is what we're really hearing, that, all this sort of crackpot ideas about bone density means that black people can't swim, and, all kinds of stuff like, what was that, some extra bone in the leg. This is what racism does. It gives pseudoscience, so as opposed to your proper lovely genetics in the lab, this is how it's reeled out into the world, into the social world, so that we have pseudoscientific explanations for why certain groups are better at something than the other. So, for example, you were talking about sport, and, the black prowess at sport can be explained in these crackpot ways. But we also have, at the other end of the scheme, equally as crackpot ideas about intelligence and who's more intelligent than the other. And, and I want to go back to the old, 19th century ideas about racial difference, because we still have ideas lived out today about black people being less intelligent. And I do a lot of research in education, and this is something that we pick up all the time. So if there's no genetic differences between groups, why do some groups do better than others in schools, in education? And that is largely because we have imbued these ideas, these pseudoscientific ideas about difference, and we live them out in our daily life. So what we find a really strong determinant of how people do well or not in school is the expectations of the teachers. And those expectations of the teachers are you and I in this room, influenced by all sorts of historical and geographical and pseudoscientific ideas about difference. And one of the big ways in which race has always been manifest itself is through differences in gender and in sexuality and in class. So we think in those ways, and that becomes the truth. that becomes the way that we see the world. So we find that teachers, I was recently doing a piece of research, and a teacher said black boys could never do well because they have lower IQs. So what is the point in even bothering with them? This is what a teacher told me. And we have to think, where did that come from? And the boys that he teaches, and he was a science teacher, by the way. So science is more than just genetics. It is social in so many different ways. And this teacher had been to university, he'd been through the whole education system, and no one had challenged his racism. And he believed this. He absolutely believed it, because he came to a workshop of mine, which was about diversity, multiculturalism. He wanted to learn more about it, how he could extend this idea, and how we could have special education for young black people, young black men, as a good thing, as an anti-racist thing. So this is how race lives in the social world. And I think that's something we really need to think about.
So hands are shooting up all over the place, as I anticipate. Do you want to make the point?
No, that's
okay, fine. So I did say I'd go to the balcony first. So there were two. I can't really see because of the lights, but why don't you judge for yourselves and speak, and then I'm going to go over here. And oh, bloody hell! Calm down.
On the question of that you were discussing a few moments ago on the East African runners, I mean, I think it's fairly well known that because they live at high altitude, they're able to take up oxygen more efficiently, because that's the way they've had to be with the lower oxygen content of the air where they've grown up. So that's what helps them with their running. But also on the question of the hypertension you were talking about earlier, it may well be lifestyle that causes black people to have more hypertension in the first place, but there's certainly, it's well documented that they do not respond very well to the drugs that other people respond to, and that's why the drug companies have targeted them, rightly so, in my view, to try and solve this problem for them.
Okay.
But sorry, on to my question.
We've got a lot of questions to get through. So
this is it. Okay, just quickly. I'd heard or read somewhere that Neanderthal genes have been found in Europeans, but not in Africans. Is that correct?
No, it's not. So the average genetic content of someone of largely European descent that is Neanderthal is about 2.7%, and that's fairly universal. I'm 2.7%. And all genomic studies have shown so far of people in Africa, who currently live in Africa, and have ancestry in Africa in the last few thousand years, also contain Neanderthal DNA at a lower frequency, due to migration back into Africa that occurred between 3,000 and 4,500 years ago. And you're forgiven for not knowing that, because that was published 2 weeks ago. On the question of genes that relate to having evolved in places of high altitude, it is not an irrelevant point, but it doesn't account for the fact that there are singularly no Tibetans who have ever won.
Or Andean.
Or Andeans. Or indeed Dutch people, because there is a small subgroup of Dutch people that have exactly the same mutation, which allows high processing of oxygen, which kind of makes the point.
Completely off topic as well. The Tibetan high altitude adaptation came from Denisovan, which are contemporaries of Neanderthal. So Neanderthal and Denisovans are extinct human lineages, and the Tibetan high altitude came from actually their mixing with the Denisovans.
So it's all a big melting pot. Right, I did actually say that. So there was another question. Thank you. There was another question up on the balcony, and then I'll bring it back down here. I don't know. Stick your hand up if you have a question. If you don't, is there a mic down
here?
Hi. Oh, go on.
Sorry. Hi. I just wanted to go back to the question about the biological basis of race, because I'm sorry to take it back to the hypertension point, but I also want to draw a parallel with the management of kidney disease in different races as well, which again is largely based on race in some situations. And I just wanted to make it clear that I think to put all of that down, to put the management being different in different races, to put it all down to social constructs and pseudoscience is irresponsible, because there are scientific bases to it, and it is based on race, and although it's obviously not to do with genotype, there is a biological basis to it, and it is being evidence-based, and I just wanted to know your opinions on that from not a genetic point of view, but a biological point of view.
Okay, so I wasn't trying to say that it was entirely pseudoscience. So there's both truth and folly, I suppose, wrapped up together. So one of the things is, say for example, I'm going to pick a really bad example because I don't know UK well enough. But like, so if you were talking about, if you're in some city in the UK and you're talking about non-English people, so people who have a different ancestry, then it's also possible that those particular individuals are closely related to each other. Not just that they're not just a random sample of people from Bengal, but they are a related group, or even if it's not first cousins, still a related group. So there will be a genetic certain consistency within that group potentially. So there can be both true in the group you're looking at in a specific place, which is sometimes some of the work might be done in small locations like that, and it doesn't apply necessarily broadly. More broadly than that. And so even a lot of medicine we have, works well, like it's designed to work in Europeans, and it works well in Europeans for things that are common in Europeans. So there are certain structures where certain things are more common than others. It's just not as direct and good it's not as perfect a measure as people had thought it was. So it's not that there's nothing there. There are genetic patterns, and when we see genetic patterns, it's largely to do with relatedness and not a large amount of time elapsing. We are a young species, as I said at the beginning, and so so if that answers it a little less fuzzily, I don't know.
It's also worth asking, why is it when we talk about something like hypertension, we talk about differences between blacks, whites, and Asians? Is it because there is a natural distinction between blacks, whites, and Asians which relate to hypertension? Or is it because that is the way we socially categorise society, people in society, and that within those social categories there are differences, and so we look at those differences? The point I was trying to make was that it's because there's the only way we have of socially of categorising people is the social categories that we use, that those categories become default for differences in things like hypertension or obesity or whatever. Therefore, those might be useful, but it tells us nothing about the biology of race to say that they're useful. It tells us about how we actually divide human beings in society. When somebody walks into a doctor's office, what he sees, because of the way we divide societies, is that person black, Asian, white, and so on. And therefore, those are the categories that become important to him or her in talking about hypertension or obesity or whatever. But that's why we need to distinguish between the fact that social categories may have biological differences and the fact that they have biological differences tells us something about the biology of race. They're two very distinct issues.
Okay, so this gentleman here has had his hand up for a while. And then if you could pass it back to that lady there, and then I'm going to have some questions over that side.
Thank you. As we shift towards more personalised medicine and we all get our own genetic risk profile, might that do to the idea of culture and race as a social thing and categorisation in the way that finding our place in the universe as a small planet and a rocky outcropping back onto the end of nowhere has moved us away from thinking that we're at the centre of the universe?
Yeah, well, I applaud your sentiment there, but I don't think we do think like that. So that's a good question. So do you think, anyone who wants to have a go at this?
Well, I think yes, in the sense that it might bring more out into let's say, the general public, the idea that that a lot of the genetic differences we have are quite personal. They're not necessarily group differences. So, and it actually turns out, with respect to genetic diseases, what we see is more often than not so they talk about private mutations or close to private mutations, which means they're just new to you, and it seems this is even for genetic conditions, they're not necessarily inherited. So it's genetically, but it's a new mutation. And so in terms of personalized medicine, yes, probably people are going to discover that these groupings don't make as much sense, and maybe if this becomes more mainstream in terms of medicine, it will be more broadly understood. So perhaps what you're saying, that people will just understand we're just one little part of this big population. Yeah, maybe that's a nice optimistic way of thinking about it.
I'm not nearly so optimistic about that. For this reason, the roots of racial categorization doesn't lie in genetics, doesn't lie in medicine. It lies in social factors.
True.
And however much we learn about genetics, it's not going to change those social factors. We often use genetics as a way of justifying social divisions. But the fact that we understand genetics better isn't going to change the social factors that lead to the divisions of humanity along certain lines.
I feel in the middle of you two on that.
I like being an optimist.
I feel that the more we learn about human diversity in terms of the history of human migration, the more I feel a shared affiliation with our brethren. So, simple things, simple, slightly gobsmacking things, like the last common ancestor of all Europeans was when? My students aren't allowed to answer that. Well, 15th century, right? So all white people have a common ancestor only about 500 years ago. If you go 1,000 years back, the ancestors of all Europeans are all the same people, and you only have to go 3,500 years back to have the common ancestor of everyone alive today. Now that's Aoife talks about us being a young species, but what she means is in the broad sweep of evolution, we're 200,000 years old. We only left Africa maybe 100,000 years ago. But in terms of shared ancestry, genetically or genealogically, more specifically, everyone in this room has a common ancestor less than 3,000 years ago, and most people in this room have a common ancestor less than 500 years ago.
But if you see a depiction of an ancient Greek, that he's a European rather than an African or an East Asian. How does that seem to that?
So can I answer that one? Phenotype. You're probably largely basing that on skin color, I guess. And skin color is an adaptation, so it's not a random difference. So most of the differences that we see genetically are random differences. Skin color. Okay, well, I thought he meant.
No, but they were painted, though. Marble statues in ancient Greek were painted.
It's because we're like what the lady at the end of the panel is saying is because we're programmed.
Hold on a sec.
We're programmed to think, to see those differences. I mean, I'd like to hear the panel's views a little bit more on why categories are important. Because the point that you all seem to be making is that they're leading us up a blind path. That genetics is a science in itself. It teaches us about how and where we've evolved from, and that is not a telescopic thing. It's on a it's on a spectrum. And so there is not one species or one group of people that is better or worse than another group. So yeah,
I like Kenan's idea that different categories for different purposes. So it's like what we've done socially with humans is we picked a few categories and tried to apply them everywhere. But if you're trying to understand malarial resistance, well then you better divide your groups of people into people who live in malarial regions and people who don't. If you're trying to understand skin color differences, you better divide your groups of people who live near the equator and people who live further away from the equator, because it's got to do with UV light, or fish intake, which is why Inuits have slightly dark skin. you know, so if you have different categories for different purposes, so categories have a usefulness, but the idea that there's one category that suits every purpose, every medical application, every historical study is not true, but unfortunately, we keep doing it.
We need categories. Sorry, go on, Heidi.
No, you can go.
I'm saying we need categories because we can't study everything as a blob. It is a practical, pragmatic way that and it's not just genetics that uses categories. Every form of, you know, whether you're talking about natural sciences, social science, you need all sorts of categories. The issue is how we understand and what significance we impute into those categories. You know, if you had a white Boeing 707 and a red Ferrari, the fact that one's white and the other's red is of little significance. The fact that one has a jet engine, the other has an internal combustion engine, is probably of great significance. But if you're on a desert island, even that probably has no significance at all. In other words, differences matter, categorization matter, but they matter in context and according to the question you want to answer. And I think the problem with the way we think about race is that we think one set of categories answers all our questions for us. That's the problem, I think, with the way
okay, hold on
a
second. So Heidi's going to make a point. It's worth mentioning, I wasn't suggesting that everyone 3,000 years ago was a single population. It's just that that's how far you have to go back in order for us to have shared ancestry with everyone. And that's not saying we came from that population. It's just that that's...
One ancestor in common at that time.
Yes.
One of the many.
Yes.
It's not that everybody's...
Heidi.
So it's like, of all the ancestors you have at that time, everybody in this room has one of them shared.
Yeah.
Questions about categories are really important. If I was to tell everyone in this room that we're all just humanity, we're all just one single human race, which we very much love to stay in this post-race world where we've thrown race out the door. If I said that, you know, you aren't a black woman, you aren't a white woman, you're not a black man, you're not a white woman. If I said that, whatever you are, if I said, without asking you, I'm sorry for making assumptions, but if I said that, how would you feel about yourself? The question is, we're deeply invested in difference, and that difference makes our world turn. If I said to you, you know, that your ethnicity didn't matter, it's part of your makeup, it's part of your history, it's part of your struggle, it's part of who you are, your lineage, your ancestry. So you come from a history, and that is really important. So identity is important. And if we want to look at categories free of identity, it's meaningless. So we can say that race is meaningless genetically, and thank God for that, because it gives us some perspective on identity. And one of the biggest industries at the moment around genetics is ancestry, which in fact is a proxy for race. How to find your lineages, how to go back in time and find who you are. Well, if race doesn't exist, what are these companies selling? This is the question I have to ask. They're selling hope, desire, they're selling all kinds of things because we need to be located in an identity for our social world to work.
Now, I'm going to ask you to not speak for a second because we need to share this out. So there's this lady up here has the microphone, and then we're going to go up there to the fourth row back. Thank you. So you first.
So I just wanted to ask, when you talk about genetic studies, you're working on the assumption that that sequence of DNA, all those letters, will directly lead to the biological differences that you see between people. But
sorry, say the last bit again. It'll lead to
the biological sort of differences that you see between people. But how safe is that assumption? I mean, you've got, you know, your sequence of letters, but that's just sort of one level, and then, you know, it's the way that kind of interacts, and I don't know, I'm not sure.
I get your question. So it's actually not the assumption. So the assumption is not necessarily that the sequences, the differences in the DNA sequence directly lead to biological differences for a couple of reasons. When people are doing what they're trying to do, one thing that's definitely certain about DNA is you got your DNA from your parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents. So what we know about DNA is that it is a record like transmitted from the past. And that is the only thing that we say is certain about DNA. And so it is a common misconception in general, not like, so even among scientists, that genes are very deterministic, that the gene you have here and the sequence letter you have there, which is different from somebody else, makes you X instead of Y. And that isn't the case. So it's not the case that, there are biological differences that are not genetic in the sense that they are not lifestyle, or that your genes set you up with a slightly higher chance in this direction than that direction, but they don't determine one way or the other. You could still go either way. So in terms of the genetic studies, all they are trying to do is say they're looking at the patterns of diversity and not actually trying to relate them at all. So these ones that are big surveys, big population-wide surveys, like global surveys, are not trying to relate them at all to biological traits. They're only saying what is the pattern of sharing of genetic differences. And most of the time, the sharing of genetic differences is family sharing, right? It's relative. So that's all it's trying to do.
Okay. The lady 4 rows back.
Questions for Heidi. So Heidi, how do we escape all these different racial constructs and all the different categorisations that happen as a result of that, particularly looking at mixedness and the mixed race population and how fast that's growing? What's the future in the ways in which our social filters sort of designate where we are? And in particular, I want you to talk about mixedness and
yeah. Well, Adam's had a genetic test where he's found out he's 50-50 of.
I didn't need a genetic test.
He just had to ask his parents. That's a really interesting question, because the issue of being mixed, and I am mixed. Well, I'm called Heidi because I have an Austrian mother and a Caribbean father. So I know that mixedness is a very important question in terms of the value of those people who are mixed. What value are they given in society? And often it's, we like, as we were saying in terms of categories, we like rigidity. We like to know that you are black or you're white or you're, Asian or you're Indian. We use all these mixed kind of notions of difference, nationality, geography, skin color, all these things we use to denote people. And what is the really, I suppose, the damaging thing to groups that fall outside or don't seem to fit into groups is that they become stigmatized, labeled, and marginalized. And this is, where issues arise around mental health. We haven't talked about that in terms of genetics, but, feeling you don't belong is a huge issue for people, or feeling that you do belong empowers people. So when we're talking about race and race categories, we have to talk about power and who's defining whom. If you're mixed, who are you mixed in relation to? Well, who is the normal, the silent white, dominant society that you're in? You're always defined in relation to this core, central, silent power of whiteness. So, the only way to change that is to think through how we can, how we can look at systemic racism, institutional racism, how it plays out in our systems of social justice. So we have to do it socially, because if we have this information that we are biologically all the human race, then what is wrong with us in terms of racism, which remains endemic? So I hope that answers that a little bit.
I think we've got time for a couple more before we get booted out. So Professor Curry first, and then if you could pass the mic back. I think someone's got their hand up, second row. So go ahead, Stephen.
So my question follows on from the previous questioner, and it's really about whether or not modern science can actually challenge our social mores, our current sense of self, and our notions of race and racism. And comes back to this question. Oh, sorry. And comes back to the question earlier about, and Ken was a bit pessimistic about the ability of genetics to sort of challenge our current set of values. But listening to the discussion, it strikes me the historical perspective is important, because for a long time it seems as if science has actually connived or supported or even at best not challenged notions of racism. And that's because the science was relatively rudimentary. So if your biology is based on categorizing things and you're doing that largely on the basis of external appearances, then it seems reasonable to ask questions, are there biological differences between people who are of different color, for example? But now that we have the modern power of genetics, and we have learned within the last decade that actually the human race is terribly homogeneous in terms of there's a very small amount of genetic variation. Is it possible that once this becomes more widely known, I mean, this educated audience already knows it, but are other members of the panel more optimistic that actually the science is much better now and is actually challenging our notions of categorization? Categorization is important, but it's not rigid, it's not fixed. And it will change with our understanding.
I want Kenan to answer that. I mean, my feeling, though, is it's a good start. Right? So we have got to the point, I feel satisfied that people like Aoife and I can make the statement based on the data, based on what we understand about human variation by the determinants of human variation at a biological level, it has no value. The term race has no value. That, to me, I'm less willing to go further than that, because I'm not a social scientist nor a social commentator. But that seems to me to be an enormous amount of progress from the origin of genetics, which was Francis Galton, book out in September. It's not just about him. In that he set up a science which, as a racist, set up a science in which he was attempting to demonstrate social hierarchies and categorization of people. And science did a very good job of ultimately demonstrating that he was wrong in his prejudices. Now that to me is a really robust point for us to go forward from. So we have conversations like this so that the broader issues are at least can't be based in the science.
That may be true, but that doesn't mean that our shifting notions of science will undermine our social categories of people. It wasn't science that created the categories in the first place. Science became a justification for socially created categories. Today, the distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims, and Muslims and Christians, isn't based on genetics. It's based on notions of culture. Culture, often these days, has the same kind of essential quality in people's mind as race once used to have. So whatever we say about genetics and the genetics of human differences and the genetics of race, that's not going to transform the social reasons why we do categorize people and why we do think that certain people are us and certain people are the other. That is a much broader issue. And while I welcome developments in genetics, I don't think it's going to change that.
I think it absolutely will. We've gone past...
Can you speak up, because the mic's not with you?
Sinister left-handedness. Most of us don't believe in witchcraft anymore. Francis Galton used to believe in phrenology, but he developed in his own lifetime. I passionately agree with the view that education develops. Most of us have heard statistics about how closely we relate to learning. Then eventually we'll get past the superstition and we'll come to value people on other things that become more sensible.
Well, that's a very optimistic point of view. I did say we would have one more question, even though we're over time, but I need to honour that. And it is the second row back on the right-hand side.
Thank you.
Let's make it snappy, shall we, so we can all go to the pub.
To what extent does the panel think that it is valid for individuals to choose to identify with perhaps a socially constructed idea of ethnicity that might not actually be genetically theirs. I just want to mention, in the light of in the past in the US, I think that people that were considered to have black ancestry weren't allowed to marry white people, so would sometimes pretend to be white so they could marry who they wanted, and vice versa. Would we judge them negatively for that? And people who might do that nowadays for social reasons to try and pass as a different ethnicity, to what extent is that a valid choice that people should or can make?
It's a big question. And in fact, it was the premise for this talk, which was about looking at somebody like Rachel Dolezal, who is white, phenotypically white, genetically the same as everyone else, we might say, and yet she wanted and desired to be black, and she masqueraded, or we could say minstreled, like the black and white minstrel. She dressed up as someone who is black. Now, that is only possible because our notions of race have shifted from 50 years ago. I know that my parents, when they married in the 50s and had me, that was a moment where you would still be hung if you were a black man who married a white woman. And now we have this situation of, moving between groups, or more fluid ideas about difference. And yet we still have, strong racial identifications. And I would suggest that Rachel Dolezal, in doing that, if you like, negated the kind of history of struggle of what it really means to be black. So when we talk about distinctions and categories, we have to talk about the history of those categories. Is that helpful?
I am going to close proceedings now on that note, because we are over time, but if you could just thank our panel, and then we can all go to the panel.